This is the agenda for today. We're going to talk about ethics from a broad perspective. Then we're going to move to the PMI Professional Code of Conduct, and then their Ethical Decision-Making Framework. And we're going to talk about why ethics matters in project performance and why we shouldn't treat it as just kind of an extra thing that we do. When we look at ethics in organizations and society, we'll look at it from a very broad perspective, and then we'll focus back down on the principles like justice, honesty, responsibility, respect, and compassion. And then we'll move into the project management. It's called the Ethical Decision-Making Framework. And then we'll have a few little real world things, but most of that will be from your discussion that you do. Ethics is essential to project management performance in society. And so ethical project management protects performance, trust, and social impact. And think of that term protects, right? We want to protect our project performance. And it could be a matter of reducing risk. Project management ethics, it's not a side issue and it's not an optional professional value. It's central to how projects perform and how organizations are perceived. And ethical choices that we make influence the accuracy of our reporting, how we treat our stakeholders, how we use resources, and the long-term credibility of the project team and the organization. And in many cases, the decisions that we make also in our projects affect society more broadly. Especially if we're working on some kind of public works project, there's externalities that can be done. Things like public trust, sustainability, safety, privacy, fairness, items like that. This is why the ethical principles belong at the center of project performance management rather than at the margins. In other words, it's key to this. It's important in planning as well, because we have to plan ethically and the whole thing. But when we're actually really doing the work and we're interacting more with stakeholders and society at large, it becomes a critical thing that we do. Before we look at the framework, we can look at ethics more broadly in the context of project management. Project managers often face situations where it's not simply what is allowed, but rather what's the right thing to do. Ethics guides project decisions when the rules aren't enough, when the rules alone aren't enough. We have laws, policies, procedures, all those things are important, but they don't fully resolve every difficult situation. So in practice, project decisions are shaped by schedule, budget pressures, stakeholder demands, uncertainty about risk and consequences. And all these competing forces make it tempting to focus only what's the fastest, easiest, and most politically convenient thing to do. This is where ethics comes essential. Ethical judgment helps protect managers. It helps us to decide what's not only allowable, but what's the responsible, fair, honest, and respectful thing to do. In other words, ethics matters when the project management environment is ambiguous, when we don't really know what to do, when the pressure to compromise is real and significant. Strong project leadership requires the ability to recognize these pressures and to make decisions that protect the integrity of the stakeholders and protects stakeholder trust and the broader interests that are affected by the project work. Because projects operate within organizations, these ethical issues often appear in everyday decisions about how we report on resources, how we deal with authority, and stakeholder relationships. In project work and organizations, ethical issues in projects often emerge through everyday organizational decisions, things we do every day. And in project management, these issues often arise through ordinary decisions rather than crisis, right? Ethical decisions pop up. They appear in how project managers report progress, allocate resources, communicate with stakeholders, exercise authority, and how we treat our team members. For example, a status report can be molded or shaped to inform honestly or to protect appearances, right? We could be transparent or we can mold it to protect appearances. Resources can be assigned based on project need by favoritism, and we want to avoid the favoritism or politics. Communication can build trust through transparency or it can create confusion through omission. And because these choices happen regularly, ethics, these decisions are woven into our everyday performance. And this means that ethical project management is not only about avoiding misconduct, but it's about practicing integrity consistently in our routine decisions to shape outcomes. One of the weaknesses that I always had as a project manager is I'm kind of a take charge guy when it comes to running projects. And as long as the project was doing well, I didn't really feel a need to report out much, right? Well, what that does is that creates from the stakeholders, they don't know what's going on. What happens to us when we don't know what's going on as humans? What do? We always assume the worst, right? All of a sudden you got stakeholders demanding things and you think they're questioning you, you're doing the best you can. You can, by being transparent and I had to learn this. I had to learn to be more proactive in keeping stakeholders engaged and all this and getting that feedback to get them included. Because I wasn't trying to do anything unethical, but it appeared that way, right? That I was hiding something, but I wasn't. So how this kind of affected me in the real world things. Because projects affect more than just internal operations, ethical responsibilities extend beyond just our organization and into stakeholders and society. And we see this all the time these days with like all these, we were just talking about AI, with the impact it's having. Those projects, to develop those tools is affecting the greater society. Ethics is important there, and there's a lot of questions about sort of the underlying intentions of some of these folks that are doing that work. Social responsibility is another ethical key. Projects create ethical responsibilities that extend beyond the organization. Project managers don't operate in an ethical vacuum. Decisions made within a project can affect people, systems, far beyond the organization itself. Project managers need to consider how our projects affect the greater community during execution and even beyond after completion. The products that we develop in projects have a life cycle. Typically, in a project management, sort of the more traditional way of looking at things, we would produce some kind of outcome, benefit, or result, and then we would disband the team. But that benefit, product, result still lived in the organization or out in the public. And the view has changed over the years that we have a responsibility when we're building the product or benefit to make sure that it's sustainable in how that life cycle is going on, how it affects after, right? And what the life cycle looks like and how that's going. Now, we see nowadays with especially with software, some of the newer technologies we use, like continuous integration and the CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, that the project teams never really stop working on it. They stay with at least some part of the project team stays with the product throughout its life cycle. Think of an iPhone. They keep adding more to it. That team, the teams that built that, they just keep going. Someday it'll reach end of life and it'll go wherever it goes. But we're seeing more of that whole product view now. And if those of you that are in the Agile program will get a flavor for this when we talk about how the project, well, and we'll even talk about it a little bit in this class, but how the adaptive models tend to promote this continuous deployment feature. Because project management depends on ethical judgment, we need to step back and look at ethics in general, more broadly, before we go through and examine this. So what are ethics, right? What is ethics? Ethics concerns the principles of right conduct, fairness, responsibility, and respect. And you're going to hear me repeat that through the theme, if you haven't already noticed it. At its most basic level, ethics refers to moral principles that guide decisions, actions, and conduct. And it helps individuals and organizations think about what's right, what's fair, what's responsible, and what's respectful, especially when decisions affect other people, okay? And it's broader than just personal preference and broader than simply following the rules. The broader understanding is important because project management ethics begins with these universal principles and then applies them into a professional context, such as leadership, stakeholder relationships, organizational behavior, social responsibility, and those items. So we can frame ethical principles as values and standards guiding decision-making and action. And ethics can vary, what's moral can vary from culture to culture. And what we address here is more of the Western view of morality. So just take that into account. That's what we've done. The other cultures can have different views of what's moral and what's not. And so we're sticking with the sort of the classical Western view here. But although ethics can be defined broadly, there's core principles that consistently appear across traditions and professional settings. So we'll talk about those. So some of the core principles, there are several core principles that consistently shape these ethical conduct across traditions and professional settings, as I mentioned. And there's several, these core principles help explain what ethical conduct looks like in practice. Right? So justice encompasses fairness and impartiality. Honesty centers on truthfulness and transparency. Responsibility focuses on accountability for actions and consequences. And respect recognizes the dignity and worth of others. Kindness and compassion encourage actions that reduce harm and promote well-being. And so these principles provide a practical foundation for understanding ethical behavior before we connect them to more specifically to project management. So the first of these principles is justice. Justice requires fairness, equity, and impartial treatment in decisions and opportunities and responsibilities. So it's a foundational ethical principle because it emphasizes this fairness and equity and impartiality and consistent treatment. So these ideas help explain what it means to treat people rightly in our decisions, our processes, and outcomes. It means people are treated in a way that is reasonable, just, and free from favoritism. It asks whether the process and outcome are balanced and appropriate. So equity, that's fairness. Equity means giving thoughtful consideration to people's different needs, circumstances, or barriers so that treatment is not only equal but just. Equity recognizes that fairness does not always mean giving everyone the exact same thing. Okay. Impartiality means making decisions objectively rather than allowing bias, personal preference, or outside pressure to influence the outcome. It requires neutrality and sound judgment. Impartiality does. Consistent treatment means that similar cases are handled in similar ways. It promotes trust because people can see that rules, opportunities, and expectations are applied reliably rather than selectively. Okay, that they can count on what you're doing. So for example, a project manager assigns training opportunities to only favored team members. That would violate the justice because the decision wouldn't be neutral. It wouldn't be neutral or impartial. A more just approach would be to use some kind of transparent criteria to consider who gets the training and then apply that decision consistently. That demonstrates ethics. In a professional setting, justice matters because decisions about resources, recognition, workload, accountability, and access can impact individuals and groups. Another core ethical principle, justice. In professional settings, justice matters because decisions about resources, recognition, workload, accountability, and access can significantly affect individuals and groups. So in project management, the principle connects to fair allocation of stakeholder consideration and unbiased decision-making. Another core ethical principle is honesty, which fairness and truthness, integrity and transparency all work together in action. So honesty builds trust through truthfulness, integrity and transparency in communication and action. So it's also one of the core principles. Truthfulness means communicating acts accurately, avoiding deception or misleading statements. Integrity means aligning one's words, values, and actions so that the conduct is consistent and trustworthy. Transparency means being open and clear enough that others can understand relevant decisions, information, and intentions rather than just being kept in the dark. I'm sure we've all probably experienced that where we don't really know what's going on, and it creates a lot of anxiety when that happens. These qualities build trust, which is essential to both personal and professional relationships. Without honesty, communication becomes unreliable, decisions become distorted, and confidence in people or institution erodes. So in a professional setting, honesty helps assure that information is accurate, that commitments are credible, and that stakeholders can make informed decisions. For example, if a project manager knows that a major deliverable is going to be delayed, but reports the project is on track to avoid criticism, that would violate the honesty principle. A more ethical approach would be to communicate the delay clearly, explain the causes, and outline a response plan. And in project management, honesty later connects directly to status reporting and stakeholder communications. One thing about this honesty, this concept here of explaining the causes, one of the things that I mentioned here is formulating a response plan. It's one thing just to go and tell them that something's wrong, but it's always better to say, this is what I think we should do. Maybe have several choices, and you're going to be a lot more successful with your stakeholders if you give them that option. And then they'll help. Most of the time, I don't think I've ever been on, maybe I've been on one or two projects where I thought that maybe some of the stakeholders wanted to purposely sabotage the project, but for the most part, stakeholders want you to succeed, and they want to help you succeed. If you provide honest information with options to help, they'll help you. Okay, so it's important to know that is how these ethical situations affect that. Responsibility is another core ethical principle. It requires accountability for decisions and actions and consequences in both conduct and in leadership. It's a ethical principle because it requires people to take ownership of their decisions and their actions. And when we're talking about ownership, if you haven't read the book yet, Extreme Ownership, he's a Marine commander guy. I can't think of his name, Jaco, something like that. He and his partner wrote this book, but it's an awesome book that would really help you in projects. It's called Extreme Ownership. Ownership means recognizing that ethical conduct includes both action and inaction, and that people are responsible not only for what they choose to do, but what they fail to address when they should act, right? Taking ownership of it. Consequences refers to the effects that decisions have on others, on organizations, and sometimes on society. So ethical responsibility requires people to think carefully about these effects before they act. Responsibility also implies thoughtful and considerate behavior. It means making decisions with awareness of the risk, the impacts, and the duties rather than acting carelessly or for short-term advantage. So in a professional setting, responsibility strengthens trust because others can rely on people who follow through, acknowledge mistakes, and respond appropriately to problems when they arise. An example here is if a project manager becomes aware of a serious risk, but ignores it to avoid conflict or to project some kind of a appearance, it would be a failure of responsibility. So ignoring things is, you're not taking ownership when you ignore things. So a more ethical response would be to raise the concern, assess the likely impact, take appropriate action, even if the message is unwelcome. And one thing about this one here between responsibility and honesty, they're real closely aligned with being transparent and being sort of proactive. So in project management, responsibility later connects directly to accountability, to the project management principles of stewardship and decision-making and follow-through. Another ethical principle is respect, which recognizes dignity, worth, and voice in every person. So respect is recognizing the dignity, worth, and voice of every person through empathy, listening, and equitable treatment. It's a core ethical principle because it recognizes this inherent dignity, worth, and voice of everybody that we have. Everybody has a certain dignity that it's a right, basically. So if you want to say a God-given right, a God-given feature, it begins with understanding that individuals should not be treated merely as obstacles, tools, or means to an end, but as persons delivering consideration and humane treatment. So one thing's about this, back in the mid-'80s, I want to say, something happened in the way that companies looked at their finances. And all of a sudden, their workforce became just another machine on the books. And it's proceeded it goes through the day. So the word was if you need to cut expenses, the first thing you do is you go cut labor, like you would discard something, right? that kind of behavior is a lack of respect for the people that work for you. We see some of that now with like the layoffs that are happening in the technology field. What's happened is this mindset that we're as individuals, we're all just basically a representation of some skill stack we have, and we're not people. We're just skills. When we're on teams, one of the big things about managing project teams is this respect for your team members. And most of the project I work on now, at least I've worked on the last several years, I haven't worked on one in a couple of years because I've been doing stuff for Amerton, but I couldn't do the work that they do, right? So my job mostly is to remove roadblocks and help them do their work. So it requires utmost respect for the team members if you want to earn their trust, because they look at me and say, well, what does he know? He doesn't know anything. He's just in the way. I don't want to be in the way. And so by being respectful, you can earn that trust. So dignity means acknowledging the inherent value of each person. It suggests that people deserve to be treated with decency and not demeaned, ignored, or exploited. Empathy means making an effort to understand the experiences, the need, and the perspective of others. It doesn't always mean agreement, but it does require some regard or thoughtful regard of how my decisions or the decisions of the project team affect people. Okay, so empathize, put yourself in their shoes, so to speak. Listening means taking others seriously to hear their concerns, ideas, and perspective. And respectful listening creates a space for participation, inclusion, and better judgment. So you've heard this concept of active listening. That's active listening. Equitable treatment means interacting with others fairly and appropriately without dismissing or marginalizing them because of their status, their background, or their difference, right? So we want to be treated equitably. So if a project manager ignores input from team members because they're quieter or less junior, that would violate respect by failing to value the voice and their perspective of those people. So a more respectful approach would be to create a space for all team members to contribute and to consider their input seriously. One of the ways we do this in the modern project management world is that there's team sync meetings, or they call them stand-up meetings in the agile world, but it's coming over into the traditional world as well, is the team meets every day for 15 minutes, and we each get to say what we did to help the team meet its goals, what issues we had, and it gives a way to acknowledge the work, not only coordinate the work and synchronize it, but it also gives a way to give people to get some recognition for what they're doing. And it gives you as a project manager, what you want to be listening for is what kind of roadblocks do I have? What kind of issues I have? So that's a key performance thing. So this is where this notion of respect can help. So kindness and compassion, we want to reduce harm and promote human well-being through empathy, care, and supportive action. So kindness, they're important ethical principle because it focuses on how we respond to others' needs, struggles, and well-being. So while justice emphasizes fairness, honesty, and emphasizes truthfulness, kindness and compassion emphasize this human concern. They're all related, and the willingness to reduce harm. So kindness refers to acting with consideration, goodwill, and care towards others. It's usually expressed every day through everyday behavior, how patient we are with people, how helpful we can be, the encouragement we give other people, and just general thoughtful treatment. Compassion takes us, it's a little step further than just kindness, but it's a step to further recognizing that suffering and difficulty or vulnerability and responding in a way that seeks to alleviate it. It involves empathy and action, so we need to empathize with that. Care means being attentive to how decisions and behaviors affect other people, especially when those may be made under pressure and overlooked or harmed. And then supportive action means responding constructively rather than indifferently. So it involves choosing actions that protect well-being and preserve dignity. Okay, so if a project team member is struggling under an unrealistic workload, which happens, we'll talk about resource leveling in the class, but a purely transactional response might ignore the issue and focus only on the output. It's either get the job done or not. If you got to work 80 hours to get it done, tough. That's not a very kind or compassionate response, right? So a more compassionate response would be to recognize that the strain, to adjust expectations where possible, and provide support while we maintain accountability. Okay. And in professional settings, kindness and cooperation help create healthier relationships and stronger teams and more human forms of leadership. So when we take all these things together, these principles show that ethical conduct is not built on a single idea, but it's a set of interconnected values that reinforce each other. So we have these 4 principles. If these are considered universally accepted principles of ethics. So ethical principles are interconnected, we talked about. Ethical conduct depends on interconnected principles that work together rather than in isolation. So this helps us see that this slide here is a graphical representation that shows us that justice, honesty, responsibility, respect, and kindness and compassion are not separate boxes. They're in real decisions that overlap one another. And so we can discuss the principles one at a time, like in this presentation, but in practice, they're all interconnected. Ethical conduct's rarely shaped by just one principle. So instead, sound moral judgment depends on several principles working together. So for example, justice is stronger when it's supported by honesty, because fairness depends on truthful information and transparent processes. Responsibility strengthens justice because fair decisions also require accountability for how those decisions are made and what consequences that follow. Respect helps ensure that fairness is not abstract, but attentive to the dignity and voice of real people. Respect helps ensure that kindness and compassion add a human dimension, reminding us that ethical conduct should not only be fair and truthful, but also attentive to harm and the needs and well-being of others. So these connections matter because actual ethical problems in a professional life can be very complex. A decision may require truthfulness, fairness, accountability, respect, and care all at the same time. So understanding the interdependence of these principles helps us as project managers make more balanced and thoughtful judgments. It prepares us to see how professional ethics, which will move out of the more general ethics into more professional stuff. So these universal principles become especially meaningful when they're applied in professional settings, such as project management. Project management applies ethical principles to decisions about people, resources, and outcomes. Ethical principles that we've discussed are not just abstract ideas that remain outside of the project. They're applied in practical decisions involving the people, the resources and stakeholder relationships, organizational priorities, project outcomes. Project managers make decisions that influence schedules, budgets, quality, risk, communication, accountability, and how we treat others and team members. And because of that, these principles become part of our everyday project management leadership. And so justice matters when opportunities and responsibilities and resources need to be distributed fairly. Responsibility matters when project managers need to own decisions and their consequences. Respect matters in how teams and clients and stakeholders are treated. And kindness and compassion matter when leadership needs to be humane and especially under pressure. In this sense, project management ethics is the practical application of these universal principles within our professional work. And they help guide our decisions and not only towards project success, but towards responsible and trustworthy performance. So to support this kind of ethics, the PMI, the project management professionals, came up with 2 main things. One is the PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, and the other is the Ethical Decision-Making Framework. So the Code of Conduct for project managers formalizes ethics through the Code of Conduct, and they're grounded in these principles of responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty. So what we're doing now is we're transitioning from these universal principles to more profession decision ethics, specific ethics like project management. And it shows how project management does not only rely on abstract moral ideas, but the profession has more professional framework through the PMI's Code of Ethics, the professional conduct. And the ethical principles that we've discussed become more concrete through these standards. So we're taking these and we're applying them to specifically to project conduct, how we conduct ourselves as project managers. PMI has formalized these ethics through the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, which provides a common framework for how project professionals think and act. And according to PMI, the 4 values that ground the code are responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty. And these values directly connect to the universal principles that we've just reviewed, but PMI applies them specifically to the practice of project management. The code itself, the Code of Conduct, is just not a statement of ideas. It has 2 things called aspirational and mandatory standards built into it. Aspirational standards, they describe the conduct that we strive to uphold, which go to the higher level of the ethical principles. And then there's mandatory standards, things that are requirements for professional behavior. So it applies to PMI members. If you got a PMP, you have to say, I agree to do this, but also to volunteers and everything. So everybody on the PMI considers this applicable to everybody that's working on the project. And it matters because project managers face situations involving competing interests, pressure to conform, politics, and the consequences, and the decisions we make have consequences for people in our organization. So this formal code helps us move from these general ideas to more concrete expectations. In other words, PMI gives the profession a shared ethical language for conduct, accountability, and decision-making. So it's a common thing. So the first one here is responsibility. This requires project managers to own the decisions like we talked about before. It's the first PMI value slide that we have. And it takes a broad ethical idea of responsibility and shows how PMI wants us to apply it specifically to project management practice. So it's in its current guidance, it says that ethics is about making the best possible decisions concerning people, resources, and environment. In the framework, responsibility means more than just being assigned a task. It means taking ownership. Remember, we had that ownership concept of decisions, actions, and their consequences. It includes honoring our commitments, being accountable to outcomes, addressing problems rather than avoiding them. And in project management, this is important because our decisions can affect our environment and the people in it. And we treat this responsibility of professional conduct just not of task execution, right? It goes above just doing the work. A responsible project manager does not hide risk, avoid difficult conversations, or shift blame. Instead, they raise these concerns, respond thoughtfully, and act to protect it. We've talked about how that works. The next one is respect. Respect requires project managers to recognize the dignity, the perspective, and the contributions of others. You can start seeing how they've kind of coming down from the higher stuff. PMI defines respect as listening, valuing others, and creating conditions in which people can contribute and grow. Some of the same things we've seen before. The Code of Conduct makes respect concrete by emphasizing active listening, understanding others' views, and creating environments where people can contribute and grow. So it's not a passive thing, it's an active thing in a project management environment. It requires project managers to welcome diverse perspective, respond thoughtfully in disagreement, and avoid behaviors that silence or diminish others. So in project management, respect matters because successful projects depend on the collaboration among people with different roles, expertise, interests. A respectful project leader or project manager does not dismiss concerns simply because they come from a junior member or from someone with a different perspective. Instead, respect means listening carefully, taking input seriously, and communicating in ways that preserve the dignity under pressure. An example I have here is the project manager ignores a team member's concern because that person is quiet or less senior, which we've seen this before. That would violate the respect. It's the same thing that we had before. We don't want to violate respect. Next one is fairness. PMI defines fairness as making decisions objectively, disclosing conflicts of interest, and ensuring equitable treatment. So the conflict of interest thing is a new one. We haven't seen that before. And even just the appearance of conflict of interest. So in the PMI framework, fairness means making decisions impartially and objectively. This requires us to avoid favoritism, self-interest, and bias when dealing with stakeholders, team members, or vendors. Our guidance here makes fairness especially important when it comes to competing interests, resource decisions, and access to opportunities when those things are involved. So it requires project management practitioners to disclose real or potential conflicts of interest, avoid using their position for personal gain, and rely on appropriate criteria rather than personal preference. So in project management, it matters because we influence the assignments, we influence the vendor selection, we influence recognition, information access, and the overall decision-making process. So fairness is important here. A fair project manager does not give special treatment to a preferred vendor, a favored employee, an influential stakeholder without some kind of legitimate justification for doing so. And so instead, fairness requires transparency, objectivity, and equitable treatment. Honesty, again, directly from the universal principles. PMI defines honesty as understanding the truth and acting truthfully in both communication and conduct. In the framework, it means more than just simply avoiding lies. It means understanding the truth and acting truthfully in both communication and conduct. Project managers should communicate or must communicate accurately, avoid misleading statement or omissions, and share information in ways that others can trust. So it matters in project management because stakeholders depend on timely and accurate information to make decisions. And like my example before, this is one of the main weaknesses I had early as a project manager is that, well, everything's going well, so why do I need to report that? Well, if you don't, they're going to assume that you're not being ethical. It's just human nature to do that. But status report, risk updates, forecasts, and other communications lose value when they're softened or distorted to protect appearances. So an honest project communicates clearly, even when the message is difficult, because transparency supports trust, credibility, and responsible action. Now, let's move on to the ethical decision-making framework. I think I've only got a few slides here, but this is one of the things that they provide for is they give us this code of conduct. But how do we apply that code of conduct? How do we do that? So we have this ethical decision-making framework, and it's a framework that provides a structured process for ethical judgment. So we move from the values to action in this part of it. And it shows that ethics is not only about which values matter, but also about how we make decisions in the face of ambiguous situations, pressure, and competing interests. So after we've looked at the core values, responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty, the next step is to understand how we should apply those values when we're faced with an ethical dilemma of some kind, right? So the first step in this decision-making framework is assessment. And PMI puts it simply, make sure you have all the facts about the dilemma before deciding. The next one is coming up with alternatives. Look for the different alternatives. Remember when I talked about when you communicate with a stakeholder about a problem, give them some choices on how you might solve a problem that we have. Those are alternatives. The next one here is analysis. Which one is the best one to do? Then choose that one. We'll go into these a little bit more. Then apply it ethically, whatever decision you made, and then follow up with action. So step one is assessment. Make sure you've got all the facts before deciding. The first step is making sure you have the facts about an ethical dilemma before deciding. It matters because issues often involve, ethical dilemmas often involve incomplete information, conflicting values, and uncertainty about the consequences. So a decision made quickly or too quickly may be efficient, but it might not be well-grounded if we don't have all the facts. PMI recognizes checking whether the situation aligns with the law, with the PMI code of conduct, checking whether it aligns. We want to check to see if it's aligned with the code of conduct and professional conduct. Also, we want to make sure it aligns with our employer's code, our client's code, if we're working with a client, and then we follow the laws and all of that sort of stuff. And so assessment's not just about gathering facts, but also identifying the standards and values that apply. So what is the issue? What is the ethical issue that we're dealing with? First of all, name it, identify it. What facts are known? What facts are missing? Who may be effective and what policies or professional obligations apply are some of the questions you want to answer. If we have a project manager that suspects a vendor has received unfair preference, the first ethical response is to gather the facts, review the process, and identify any conflict of interest concerns before reacting. That's what an ethical assessment is. So once we determine the dilemma has been assessed, and the facts are understood, the next step is to consider the available alternatives before we move on. Alternatives, the second step in the EDMF, the Ethical Decision-Making Framework, is alternatives. Identify possible choices and weigh their pros and cons before moving forward. So the PM decision describes this step as listing the possible choices and weighing the pros and cons. It also notes that if no viable solution emerges, more facts may be need to be gathered. This can validate whether or not you have enough, that question of what do we know and what do we don't know, right? In the first part of it. This step matters because ethical judgment improves when decision makers resist the first convenient answer. So in project management, this means asking, what are the realistic options? What are the trade-offs? Which stakeholders could benefit or be harmed by each choice? And then reviewing each alternative carefully, that leads to a stronger and more defensible or equitable decision. Say we have a sponsor who wants the schedule reported as green when, despite we know there's some delays. The options aren't limited to simply agreeing or refusing. Alternatives might include reporting the issue in context, proposing a revised milestone plan, escalating the concern, and documenting the risk and implications in considering alternatives. This goes back to my experience with this, making sure you do that. Once the possible alternatives have all been identified, the next step is analysis, where one candidate decision is examined more closely. So we pick the one we think is the best solution, and we look at it more closely for validity and impact. And the third step in the framework is analysis. Identify a candidate decision and test its validity and likely impact. And this PMI describes this step as identifying and testing its availability. It means asking whether the likely impacts of the decisions are acceptable, whether they are likely to create a positive effects or prevent harm to those affected, including our stakeholder, our organization, the environment, the general environment, and future generations. And this step matters because not every possible option is ethically sound. I was just reading the other day about there's a ranch or something down in Texas somewhere that cattle are just dying. And they're finding out they've got some kind of these plastics that somehow that's getting into the water system. So that's, even though they took the choice to do that, maybe it wasn't quite the right one to do for the environment. So you got to look at the consequences of the thing. Analysis requires project managers to move beyond convenience and the likely effects before acting. And so this is the point where ethical reasoning asks, not only can we do this, but what will this decision do to others, to our project? What is the impact? And is it acceptable? The next one here is application, the fourth step in the framework. This is where we test the decision that we made against ethical values before taking action. The fourth step in this stage is where the question is not only about whether the decision seems practical, but whether it aligns with the principles that should guide professional conduct. So this matters because the decision may appear efficient and defensible on the surface, but still conflict with our ethical values or organizational values of the law. And it matters because a decision may have, the project managers need to take a step back. So it matters to do this and then take a step back and examine whether the choice is consistent with the principles such as responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty. So this is how we apply this. So in project management, this means asking questions such as, does the decision reflect honesty in communication? Is it fair to those affected? Does it demonstrate responsibility for likely consequences? Does it respect the dignity and interest of our stakeholders? Framing this decision like this helps us ensure that the ethical reasoning remains connected to ethical principles, not just outcomes. So like, again, to this reporting thing, a project manager may decide to delay reporting a problem until more information is available. The application step would be to ask whether the delay is honest, fair, and responsible, or whether it withholds information a stakeholder should need. So if the decision doesn't align with these core values, then we need to probably not do it. So once the candidate decision has been tested against ethical values, the final step in here is implementing the decision and taking responsibility. The fifth step is action. Make the decision and be willing to accept accountability, responsibility for it. So this has that ownership. Do we own the decision? And here we look at the ethical decision-making framework. At this phase, we move from reflection to commitment. And this step, PMI frames this step by asking whether you're willing to be able to accept responsibility for your decision and whether you can make the decision public and still feel good about it. They used to have this thing that would tell us in training that when you make a decision, an ethical decision, would you want your mother to read about it in the newspaper, or your wife, somebody important to you? Would you want them to, now we don't have newspapers anymore, but would you want to see it on X? Nowadays people put stuff out there. It's not quite the same input these days with social media about people post, but would you want it to be public? Would you be proud of it? Be another way to say it, to do this. If you're comfortable with the decision, you should take action. If you're not, maybe you need to circle back to some of these earlier steps and look for a better solution. This step's important because ethical reasoning is incomplete if it never leads to action. It's like our planning. All this planning we do doesn't lead to any action. And I heard a great quote, and I had forgot about this quote, but the guy that wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey, Arthur C. Clarke, science fiction guy, he's got a quote, something about planning is hazardous. We want to validate, same thing here. Ethical decisions can be hazardous. So we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. Put this in context. But the example I have here for project manager concludes that the status report must reflect schedule delay honestly. Then the action step means reporting that delay clearly, without bias, explaining the implications without bias in a ethical in other words, can you explain this delay ethically? If you can't, then maybe you need to go back and gather more facts. Can you recommend the action ethically? Well, if not, go back through the framework and see where you can do this. So this framework is a really good tool, and it becomes, if applied consistently, it becomes second nature to how you do, not just as project managers, but just in life, how we treat others and how we do things. The PMI Code of Conduct and the Ethical Decision-Making Framework, taken together, and when you apply those together, give a project managers that give us the values and the processes that we need to be able to act on these, on our values when we're working in projects. So a framework that helps us make principled decisions into defensible decisions. And we talked to those of you that were in class last session, we talked about having defensible plans. And that means that the plans are credible, they're fact-based, empirical-based. Same thing here we want to make sure that we can defend the decisions, and the framework gives us a way to do that. So we can see that the PMI ethics operates on two levels. First, there's the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. That's where we identify these values. That is based on universal principles that are considered universally in society. And then we bring those down into our profession, in the Code of Conduct, and that we should behave responsibly with respect, fairness, and honesty. Second, the PMI decision-making framework provides a practical process for applying those values when we face an ethical dilemma. And it's important because project managers need more than just good intentions to do our jobs. We need both a good standard that we live by, and we need methods for applying these standards. And the thing is, most of the time when we're facing with some kind of ethical dilemma, we're going to be doing this under some kind of pressure. It could be pressure to get things done on time, pressure to meet the budget, pressure to satisfy a stakeholder, pressure to comply to regulations. It's not that we can just sit back. This stuff is dynamic. We need both the standards and the method. And the code answers the question, what values should guide my conduct? And the framework answers the question is, how should I work through a difficult decision? So in practice, they work together. And the code is the moral foundation, and the framework is the decision path. And so this helps to make choices that are not only effective, but also principled, responsible, and defensible in the organization and society. So the remaining question then is, how do these values and frameworks shape ethical conduct in real project situations? And I got a list, and you'll see a expanded list of this in the discussion question, but this is a list of ethical dilemmas. The assertion here is that ethical dilemmas in project environment often involve pressure between performance goals, stakeholder interest, and responsible conduct, which I just talked about. So there's some examples that show that the ethical dilemmas that we face are rarely abstract. In other words, they're pretty definable. In practice, they emerge when leaders face pressure to reduce costs, schedule, performance, reputation, or political convenience. So in each case, the central issue is not only whether the decision is technically possible or organizationally expedient, but whether it's honest, fair, responsible, and respectful to those affected. So we've got the Boeing 737 MAX. We've probably all heard about this. The planes were just falling out of the sky. They had consequences on the design and communication decisions around safety. They decided to cut some corners. Volkswagen, Dieselgate, that's where, I don't know if y'all remember, but back about, I'm going to say it's around 2000 or so, they were selling these Volkswagen Golf TDIs and all their diesel cars. They couldn't meet emissions standards. So they built machine they were using to measure the emissions. They tricked the software so it would think that it passed the emissions, but it hadn't. It cost them billions of dollars when it came right down to it. But they built that into the system in an unethical way. The Flint water crisis, that's where the lead is in the water and that the municipalities made decisions there. And there's all kinds of fraud and all kinds of issues like that. The Theranos, when the claims are not made, if you remember Theranos, I think of the gal's name, she said she had this technology that they could do like really sophisticated blood tests with just a drop of blood. And she never had it, but she was able to sell it to investors and she got billions of dollars. She's in jail now. She tried to emulate Steve Jobs. There's all kinds of weird stuff around it. But anyway, she defrauded a lot of people out of a lot of money based on making a false claim that she had something that she didn't have. And so vendor favoritism, though, is probably the one that we're more familiar with in the project management, or personnel favoritism. It's human nature, I think, to get on a project and have a few team members that you really know you can rely on. They become like you shouldn't do that. You should spread that out. But unless they have a title that goes along with it, like a lead developer, that's your lead software developer. So you're going to go to that person to technical things, but there's other developers there too, not just the lead developer. So you want to make sure that you're inclusive. Ethical dilemmas like that kind of exist day to day in our business. So the takeaways from this is that project management requires both sound values and discipline, judgment, and practice. The presentation here, or at least my talk here, has shown that ethics are just not peripheral to project management, that they're central to responsible performance. And that project managers make decisions every day that affect not only schedules, budgets, and deliverables, but also deal with overall trust, fairness, stakeholder welfare, and broader social outcomes. We've talked about universal ethical principles such as justice, honesty, responsibility, respect, and compassion that provide a moral foundation for conduct. And then the PMI translate those into principles and into professional values of responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty. So there's not a direct one-to-one because they've broken it down from 5 to 4. And the PMI Ethical Decision-Making Framework then provides project managers with a way to navigate ethical dilemmas. And so in the end, project management is about more than just doing work correctly and on time. It's about doing the right work, the right way, for the right reasons, with accountability, ownership, and acceptance of the consequences of our decisions. So that is the end of the class. Y'all have any questions?